Hi, I'm retired Master Sergeant William Bill Florio, United States Marine Corps and U.S. Air Force. I was born in December 7th, 1924. This day stands out to me. I was having a birthday party given to me by my classmates of high school, and all of a sudden we heard over this radio announced by Walter Winchell that this happened to be a bombing at Pearl Harbor, not knowing where Pearl Harbor was at the time. And we thought it was Orson Welles relating to one of his other fantasies that he had in the program. And all of a sudden, the truth became known after President Roosevelt announced that this was the day of infamy. So it all began in Natick, Massachusetts, which I grew up in, and I'm really proud of it because of the residents we had there. We had there Vice President Wilson, who was a vice president to Ulysses Grant. Also another teacher that was a teacher in our hometown years ago, back in the 20s, Catherine Bates, who wrote America the Beautiful. Another resident that I was proud to go to school with was John Dunn, who was the military aide to Vice President Agnew, and he was a major general in the Pentagon. But John is no longer with us. Other famous people, it was Doug Flutie, the great football player that threw the Hail Mary football game in the Sugar Bowl against Tennessee. That was some of the residents, but I could name others, but here and there, let me relate to my experience. My mother and dad were both born in Italy. My dad was a World War I veteran, and he married my mother and took her from Italy and brought her to the United States, and they settled in this little hometown of Natick, Massachusetts. It's about 18 miles west of Boston. There I went to high school. I participated in all the programs such as football, basketball, hockey, and baseball. There in World War II, there was December 7th, and I had my brother Ralph, who was at the time at Temple University, enjoying the V5 program as a Navy pilot, which he became, and he was active in many combat experience in Saipan and Truk Island. My brother Jeff, he also was drafted in the Army and participated in the Anzio Beach. I decided that there was one in the Navy, one in the Army, so I decided on the Marine Corps. So I went to the Boston Federal Building and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, and then no sooner said, I was also at the time a student at Boston College, and they told me the Marine Corps sergeant, who was the recruiting sergeant, his name was Sergeant St. Peter, and all of a sudden I says, God, I must be in a religious group of boys here. So leaving the federal building that following morning at 3 o'clock, I went to Parris Island where I had my boot training. It was a new experience. In the boot training, I figured they took these battery tests to find our aptitude. They thought I was a good mechanical, I had mechanical ability to be an aviation machinist mate. So after my boot training, they sent me to Jacksonville, Florida to be an aviation machinist mate. I happened to attend 6 months, and the day of graduation came, and I was good in theory, but my hands, I had all thumbs, and I didn't have too much faith in my ability to utilize my physical capabilities. So the day the test came, it was an oral test. A little second lieutenant walked out on the apron where all these planes were, and one plane was actually a dysfunctional plane, not knowing what it entailed, and I was supposed to go out there and fix it and get it airborne. Well, I think the good Lord was looking after me because I happened to have it, I fixed it. I had to synchronize the props, check the hydraulic system, and a little work on the ailerons and so forth. And I thought it was a plane that was really airworthy. And this second lieutenant came out and he says, Private, he says, is this plane airworthy? And I told him, I says, yes, to my best ability it is, sir. He says, go out and get a parachute. I says, get a parachute? For what reason, sir? He says, you're not supposed to question my order. Get a parachute. So I went out and got this parachute and came back, and he says, sit in the rear seat of this plane. It was called an OS-2U, called the Kingfisher. I'd never been in a plane before. I never flew before. And all of a sudden I got in that plane and he says, okay, gunner, he said, they called me a gunner then, and because I was in the gunner's seat. And we took off, and he brought the plane up, and thank God it took off and it stayed airworthy. After coming back from that flight, I was a little bit airsick, and a few other little things were going through my head in fear of the fact that this thing was going to clonk out. But I got back to the airfield, and I thanked the second lieutenant that he kept it airborne, and I ran over to the commanding officer immediately. I asked for a transfer and changed my military occupation service to something other than an aviation mechanic. He immediately said, the commanding officer said, would you like to be a gunner? I said, I'd like to be anything but a mechanic because I haven't got the faith and confidence in my ability to fix planes. So what did they do? They sent me to Cherry Point, North Carolina, where I started my air crewman's journey in radio and radar and all the facets of an air gunner. Well, they in turn decided to send me to El Centro, California, where I started my gunnery training and basic training. It was an SBD known as the Scout Bomber by Douglas, and it only had one pilot and one gunner, and I was the gunner that sat in the rear seat. Well, we flew different practice missions, hitting air targets and so forth, and over the Salton Sea, where we used to dive bomb different land targets, where a lot of my buddies, not a lot of my buddies, a few of my buddies and pilots and gunners never pulled out of their dives. So they remained in the Salton Sea. They were casualties early in the war. And then we supported Patton's tank there in Humor, Arizona. From there, from El Centro, they moved me up to El Toro up here in California. And the first time I says, boy, this California looks beautiful compared to El Centro. And El Centro was a very hot place, and I didn't care too much for the environmental surroundings and the heat and so forth that I entailed. But El Toro gave us a big lift. They had beautiful beaches and so forth. So we had dive bombing missions over near Catalina Island. This was a naval gunnery range, and it was nice because we flew over the Catalina Islands, and we used to see the girls sunbathing in some of the nice areas there, which gave us guys a great thrill. And we got one enjoyment flying over this area of Catalina Island. So we came back to El Toro, and from then on they sent me down to Miramar and put me on a troop ship in San Diego, and we headed in the Pacific, and we landed in Pearl Harbor, and it was an awesome sight to see. We saw the Arizona and many of the other ships that were shuttled, and right away our commanding officer says, he says, you see what they did to us, now let's go back and give them their own dose of medicine. So we were all hepped up in a very patriotic spirit because he instilled that motivation in us. So I went to Henderson Field in Guadalcanal. Another site was seen where I seen a lot of these crosses for the guys that laid their lives down in Guadalcanal. I didn't realize the importance of Guadalcanal until I studied about the importance of that real estate. It was the particular point where we had to protect our particular supply lines between Hawaii and Australia. From there, I was reassigned to the Bismarck Archipelago, an island called Green Island, which is up in the Solomon areas, and I got my first time, the pilot says, after our particular orientation and our briefing before we took off, we're going to a place called Cavian, which is in the Bougainville and New Guinea area, which is a heavily fortified Japanese supply depot. This was my first encounter in seeing what a Zero looked like. And we had to sit facing the tail gunner with our twin 30 machine guns. We flew in a squadron of 9 planes with fighter escorts, being F-6Fs and F-4Us. Well, we came back, and thank God nothing really happened. We didn't lose any aircraft or crew members. Came back and landed back on Green Island, which was a coral island. And there was these particular holes in our leading edge of our wings and tail, not realizing that this was a lucky strike for us to be back. So from Green Island, we then went to Cavian again and over to Rabaul, which is a very very fortified air depot for the Japanese. After we finally got this particular island bombed in their respective places, the ground forces took over and the New Guinea was then liberated. Then I went to Hollandia, which they had the greatest armada of planes and ships to go into Leyte in October of 1944. I didn't be with that group. They kept us there in Hollandia and until Leyte was secure, and then they sent us to Luzon. In Luzon, we landed in the Luzon Bay near Dagupan and formed a particular airfield by the Seabees and all the Army engineers, and it was called Mangaldan. In Mangaldan, we had the 5th Air Force and the 1st Marine Air Wing joined together. The 5th Army Air Force were B-24s and also P-51s and so forth, and we were the dive bomber squadron that was going to go in bomb Corregidor, Bataan, and Fort Stotzenberg and Manila Bay, which all the Japanese ships were sort of held at bay there because they didn't have enough fuel to bring their ships out of Manila Bay. It was a real treat for us guys because we knew that we shuttled and bombed we dive bombed a lot of the ships that couldn't protect themselves because they didn't have the energy to fire their guns and so forth. And we shuttled and bombed a lot of the Japanese ships in Manila Bay. After bombing at Fort Stotzenberg and Clark Air Force Base, the military fellas that landed in Luzon with us, the ground forces took over these strategical place, but we had a lot more bombing and support in the 1st Cavalry and other Army units up in the areas of Luzon. From Luzon, they decided that this was secure in March of 1945, and they sent me and our squadron, VMSB 244, 1st Marine Air Wing, to Mindanao. In Mindanao, we landed in a field called Malabang, and there we gave the military armed forces, and mostly Army boys, the dive bombing support in bombing various Japanese camps and so forth. And gradually, that was my last dive bombing mission in a new plane called the SB-2C4, a hell diver. Most of us thought that was a flying casket or a flying tomb, but we were lucky to survive the SB-2C4, which had a lot of faults to it. Okay, my great fun and achievement was a rest and recuperation leave to Australia. So we went to lovely Sydney, and I forget the name of the hotel, but all us flyboys got a suite of rooms in one of the nicest hotels there. And of course, we were only down there for one or two things, to enjoy the food. Well, that doesn't come in the top priority. It was the women and the drinking and the enjoyment we got as flyboys. So as we left the hotel, we were entering a bus, and the lady was a conductor. And the first time we could understand these particular Aussies, who were real nice and congenial and very friendly, she says, toodaloo, toodaloo, get your places in the pew, you mustn't miss the last bus home. Well, that was, I says, boy, they really got a very poetic way of transmitting their language to us. So that we went to this particular coffee shop, a tea shop, and engaged a couple of women to come with us to go dancing. So we danced with these girls, and they were, I'm telling you, to us, it was better than the USO back in the States, because their hubbies, their loved ones were also fighting in different areas. So after being in Australia, having a good meal, we had steak and eggs to no end, and we had good scotch and other drinks. So we had our parachute bags with us. What we did is we load up our parachute bags with some good scotch and good whiskey we brought back to the islands, the Green Island and so forth, which we took and we had an auction with it. So this was another thing about Australia that I enjoyed. the people in the country and so forth. And then we had our choice again to go to the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in another ROR to Hawaii. But at that time, I selected to go back to Australia, and other fellows went to Hawaii. Okay, I want to relate these particular medals, which at the time that we served our nation, we didn't expect all these particular awards, but they gave it to us. And I start off here. This is my Marine Corps my Marine Corps emblem and my Marine Corps wings. Air crewmen of those times, if they participated in 3 particular engagements relating to the air wings that we were given in the Marine Corps, and 3 stars represented that we had combat by air, land, and sea. Those are the 3 stars that represented that. I was not a very good shooter, so I was a rifle marksman down in boot camp. And thank God I was qualified to do so. Otherwise, they used to send fellows that couldn't qualify to cooks and bakers school. And I envy them now because they ate regular and we didn't. And then getting over here to this first medal, the Purple Heart, I got hit with flak off in Lingayen Gulf, where the Japanese artillery piece, they got a couple of our planes, but and I got wounded in the leg and in the back. And then they gave us the Naval Marine Corps Air Medal for participating in engagements from Solomons up to the Philippines. And then this is the Philippines Liberation Medal, which was awarded to us by the Philippine government. And then we got over to the particular, the Asiatic and Pacific medal, which was given to most participants that was in that World War II in the Asiatic Pacific. Then the Good Conduct Medal, if you was a good boy, you'd get one. If you didn't, you'd never get one. And then the Asiatic Pacific and the American Defense medals, and a lot of the fellows will know that these other medals besides, I had the Korean medal even when I was at Tachikawa, but I never was in any bad or combat zones. It was as long as you was in that theater, you was awarded the medal. And also the Vietnam medal. And so I go on, and I look at these medals, and sometimes I forgot where I got them from. But I was awarded these by different people and different generals. Now, this is this young fella that looks like an old man now, but here I am, 17 years old, and I'm down at Paris Island. In those days, they issued us a nice set of blues and a nice white cap, and they just decided that this would never do for a combat equipment if you ever engaged the enemy in this kind of a uniform. But it was a nice looking uniform. So that was the end of it, and as I finally left that particular blues down there to another fella that just came into a boot camp thereafter. I don't know what he ever did with it, but I should have kept it as a souvenir. This is the Commonwealth of Marianas that awarded this particular medal to us when we had a Veterans Day here at the Santa Paula Park on a Memorial Day, if I remember right. No, a Veterans Day. And the Commonwealth of Marianas appreciated what the guys did in World War II in that particular theater. Now I want to relate to the plane that I flew in, and this was the SBD Scout Bomber by Douglas. Douglas was built right here in Santa Monica. Okay, the top left picture is the SBD, which was the plane that was very instrumental in the Battle of Midway, that determined the factor on how the Americans were doing in the Pacific Theater. These are other shots in the Henderson Field and also in other areas in the Philippines. This was my position as a gunner. We had twin 30 air-cooled machine guns, and we faced the rear of the tail as we went into combat of different flying missions and strikes. Again, as we went over the SBD, again, here we are in the Philippines, bombing strategical points that took the Japanese off guard because they didn't feel this plane, which carried one 1,500-pound bomb in the fuselage, which was thrown out by a sling underneath when it was released, and 4 other 250-pound bombs in the wings. The plane was a real airborne plane, took a lot of punishment while it was engaged the enemy both by air, land, and sea. It was a faithful plane because here I am to talk about it. This is my position. This is the position I took as a gunner with our 32 twin 30 caliber machine guns, and this is one of the action pictures that was in the Post magazine, when the Post was a active magazine back in that day. After flying 65 dive bombing missions, like I said, I was given the opportunity to go back to the States on a point system. These are the kind of education that I received in the military, and I got one from some of the fellows who stayed in. Was during the Cold War, when Russia was dominant, the outfit that was worried about. And they gave me, this is my Marine Corps discharge back in 1945. And then I went to the NCO Academy in Bolin Air Force Base that most of us sergeants had to attend. It was a school of great learning, and the courses I took with the Air University, which gave me credits for my educational diploma. So that's my particular little resume of what happened to this little GI that managed to spend his time with the Marine Corps and the Air Force. And I also want to let you know that I was a 3-hat man. I started with the Marine Corps, went into the Air Force, and I was a past commander of the VFW Post 2043 here in Santa Paula.
There we go.
This was my Santa Paula hat that I wore in Post 2043 in Santa Paula.
Good. Okay.
And this was my Marine Corps veterans, which I served during World War II. And then from the Marine Corps, I served this other hat with the United States Air Force. I will say that I have many other stories to relate, and even Kilroy was a great poet that we admired back in those days. And I'm not going to recite any of his poetry because I think it's off tune. It was related to us GIs only. So, and other things, a Dilmit, I think the Navy had another saying for guys that were 8 balls and so forth. And I look at MASH once in a while and I see this guy that's always trying to get a Section 8. And those days, to try to get a Section 8 was the worst thing you could encounter. You lost your masculine maleism. So, and this is one thing we always fret upon, even though the guys were kind of depressed and broken down, coming back from flights sometimes, I noticed that some of the fellas really went into some deep depressed times because they were always in fear of one thing. Their life was on the line. And everything that the commanding officer, he was called the old man, and he was a 26-year-old Annapolis graduate that was our Marine Commandant. And he was the one that had to motivate us and try to get us out of this depressed stage. The things that we encountered both in our briefing, I'm speaking in the Marine Corps, that intelligence officer used to tell us that if we ever went down in Japanese territory, that we'd use our .45 caliber side weapon or a .38 that was here in our particular chest area, take and expend 5 of the bullets at the enemy and save 1 for yourself. So this was not exactly a good thing to hear, but we had to take it the way it was. And thank God that I never went down, but the ones that did, I don't know what the outcome was. I was given the opportunity because of the number of points that I've accumulated, and people who had about 100 points for having been participated in various campaigns and overseas, they were returned back to the continental United States, where I returned back to the United States. And 3 days before landing in San Francisco, we heard the good word that the Japanese surrendered. It was a great celebration to hit in San Francisco back then, and they greeted us with open arms, and I'm telling you, for all the drinks that you could have and all the women that you wanted. It was all waiting for us there in lovely San Francisco. We had a joyous time, and I got my ticket back to my hometown in Natick to see my mother and dad, and also to see my brother, my two brothers, who also came back from the combat theaters. That was the end of that, but I could never adapt to civilian life. And then another time when I was returned back home, I bumped into my old high school sweetheart, and she was not there to receive me, and I says, "Where is Barbara?" And he says, "Well, Barbara's married." I says, "Oh," I says, that's what happened. She didn't even write me a Dear John letter. And Dear John letter was very prevalent back in those days. Well, she done me a favor, to be truthful with you. She married another guy. So then those days we had the 5220 Club. The 5220 Club was for all guys that didn't have a job, and they gave us $20 a week to go out and rehab ourselves. Well, we didn't rehab ourselves. Most of us went to the bars that were open and the places where we could dance and have a good time. So after the 5220 Club ran out with some of the fellas, that didn't hit too well with the parents and loved ones. The other experience that I had was I did have a tattoo put on in San Diego before I was leaving. There was 9 of us air crew members that had the tattoo. I relate to this very strongly. I said that even though the tattoo had the Marine Corps emblem on it and so forth, I've always regretted that particular episode in having a tattoo put on my body. But out of those 9 members that had those tattoos, there was only 4 of us that came back. So I don't know if that was an emblem or a logo that we, at the time, being 18 years old, we thought that was a must thing in the Marine Corps to have a tattoo, or if you was in the Navy. If I ever saw one of my relatives have a tattoo today, I'd try to discourage them from having such a thing. But that's a common thing in our society today. That was the end of that, but I could never adapt to civilian life, and I decided that I couldn't go back to Boston College. I didn't have the patience or the mental capacity to settle down and study. The results, then I went in the Air Force. And that time it was 1948 that the Army Air Corps no longer was under the Army. It became a solvent Air Force unit. I joined the Air Force, and I was one of the few guys that was in one of the ace aircraft and warning outfits in a place called Palermo, New Jersey, outside of Atlantic City. At that time, we had that particular, the control of our coastlines from unknown aircraft. From there, I was a sergeant in charge of the controllers in this particular radar unit. From then they sent me over to Châteauroux, France. On the Châteauroux, France, they changed my Air Force specialty code to a contracting and procurement man, and I became a logistical support contracting officer in the NATO command in Châteauroux, France. I stayed there 3 years. And from there, I went on for 3 years. After 3 years, they sent me to a place called Richard Gabor Air Force Base in Missouri, about 18 miles east of Kansas City. And one of the best commanding officers I ever had, his name was Colonel Charles McGee. He was one of the aces in the Tuskegee Air Force. And he was not only a terrific commanding officer, to me he was very helpful, and I was very happy to be under his command. Just the other day I talked to him, and he says his fellow living members were invited by Senator Feinstein to go to the inauguration. He said it was really nice, he says, but I almost froze to death. So that was my experience with one of the best commanding officers I ever had. And then from Richard Gabor Air Force Base, I went to a place in New Hampshire called Pease Air Force Base under the Strategic Air Command, under LeMay. Good old Mr. Colonel General LeMay. And he was the old blood and guts of the Air Force. And it was a tough tour of duty because he showed no mercy for anyone that didn't cut their mustard. And not only the pilots and the air crewmen and the enlisted people, which I was a master sergeant then. I was glad to leave Pease Air Force Base, and I went to Tachikawa, Japan, which I was with the North Atlantic support group for all supplies and services needed in Korea and so forth. In Tachikawa, then I was sent to Taiwan in a place called the Air America Air Plant, in which we used to repair a lot of planes in the Southeastern Atlantic Treaty Organization. And there was General Chenault, who was the charge of this Air America plant. A very interesting man who was in the 14th Air Force. And he was not that blood and guts like LeMay. He was more congenial and considerate to us. So after leaving Taiwan, I was sent to a base called Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. There, I went to the Pentagon, and because I wrote a letter to Senator Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, at the time I was in Taiwan, my time was extended more than the 15 months required, and Senator Kennedy wrote a letter to our commanding general there, and before I knew it, I was landed in the Pentagon, and at the Pentagon, I was moved over to Andrews Air Force Base and to be a logistical man in helping the Air Force One. I saw the first Air Force One with tail number 26,000. They come into Andrews Air Force Base in the Kennedy administration. And it was nice working there, but more protocol than anything else that I ever experienced. And I had great admiration for Jacqueline Kennedy, the First Lady, who done a beautiful job in decorating that Air Force One. And Jack Kennedy, President Kennedy at the time, was a kind of man that was very understanding. He used to break his particular marching to the Air Force One, not marching, but walking to the Air Force One. He'd break this line from the generals, the admirals, and also his security guard, and walk over to a seaman or an airman first class and greeted them and talked to them. And I thought that was great. He was very much admired for that. Well, after 5 years with Air Force One, I retired in 1965. And I served under the Eisenhower, the Kennedy, and the Johnson administration. No, there's been a lot of experiences that I had while on active duty and being in Washington, D.C. During the time that President Kennedy was assassinated down in Dallas, Texas. Being in the Air Force One, we didn't sleep for about 2 nights and 2 days, making preparations for the return of this body back in Air Force One. I will say that this is when I saw the nation shed more tears in my life, and even us guys that were supposed to be the macho type military people, we shed our tears too when this body returned. He's from the, I'm from his particular locale near Brookline, Massachusetts. Natick is close by, and we knew of the Kennedy era back then with the family. And I would say that of all the people that I had great admirations as a president was Jack Kennedy. I think he inspired and motivated our country more than any other president. But I'm not going to get in the political sphere of things. So anyway, that was one of the saddest moments that I encountered in my military career. Even though I used to have buddies and different other members that we seen got killed in action, but to see the president come back in that state, to me that was the most disheartening thing that I experienced in my life. I returned back to civilian life and went to Sears Management School, which I became a manager in one of the Sears. I met one of my high school not girlfriends, but a high school classmate, and we got married, and we had 2 children, son Mark and daughter Paula, who both live here in Santa Paula. And now here I am in beautiful Santa Paula, living with the best environment I ever had. The weather and the golfing is great. And I also want to give my thanks to Ed Lynch and the Congress, the Military Congress, for doing this particular episode, because I think fellows like me, myself, and others just feel that the contribution that we made, we didn't realize how important it is until now that we sit down and relate these experiences. And I hope that other veterans will participate, because the generations that come will, I think, will be interested to know of our history. Again, thanks, Ed, for being the cameraman and our movie maker. The fact is now that I think of these particular experiences, I know that it was my young years of looking for adventure and excitement. And my life was fulfilled with all that kind of adventure and excitements during my military tour. I remain here now in peace and sovereignty and peace of mind like I never thought before, but my greatest times that I spent in an organization is with my VFW buddies here at Santa Paula, because we have a lot in common and we're doing a lot for veterans and their widows and families. And I continue to support this particular organization, and I think that a lot of the other veterans, at this time we need them. Veterans who just don't want to belong to any organization, and I'm not recruiting anybody, but it'd be nice if they would come forth and join us, because it's a worthwhile organization to be with. So that's the end of my journey in my military experience.
Of fighters commenced successful air attacks that in a matter of hours all but destroyed the United States Pacific Fleet. All of America and the free world was shocked not only by the odyssey of Japan's warlord, but the appalling damage accomplished by naval strike aircraft. This was the beginning of a new era for many young Americans and the war industry.
Hi, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm retired Master Sergeant William Florio. I retired from the United States Marine Corps and from the United States Air Force. I served our country from 1942 to 1965. This is my biography of my experiences I encountered in my young years in World War II. I was born in a little town called Natick, Massachusetts, 18 miles west of Boston. I'm very proud of that particular town, not only being born there, but we have a great heritage of people who used to reside in this small town. We had former residents of our hometown was Henry Wilson, Vice President of the United States under the United States Grant Administration. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, wrote that beautiful book on the banks of the Charles River in Natick, Massachusetts. We also have Catherine Bates, who wrote this beautiful song, America the Beautiful. She taught in my high school back in the early 20s and wrote America the Beautiful. And none other than the great athlete himself, Doug Flutie, was raised and was our high school football hero, and then went on to great fame in college, better known as the man who threw the Hail Mary touchdown. I filled the same position in my little classroom in Natick High in 1942. I received a scholarship to Boston College, but many of my friends and relatives were now serving in the armed forces. I went into the federal building in Boston, Massachusetts, passed the exam, and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. I was shortly thereafter sent to Parris Island for boot training. There I learned of a fighting Marine. It was an experience I never thought I would encounter. I'm very fortunate to have that type of training, and then after a series of battery tests, I was found to be more inclined to be aviation machinist mate or an aviation mechanic. So they sent me to aviation machinist mate school, which I attended for 6 months in Jacksonville. I performed well in theory, but in practical, in shop work. But I did pass and became an aviation mechanic. The great test was given to us, graduate mechanics, was we went out to file on the parking lot in an apron, as we call it back in those days, for planes that were completely put in a dysfunctional situation and inoperative. Our job was to take and get them airborne and fixed and repaired. I did that on a particular plane, and then the instructor came out and he said, "Private, get a parachute and you're going up in this plane." That was a test that I'll never forget. I grabbed the parachute, and I met the pilot, and he says, "Is this plane airworthy?" I agreed that I did the best I could as a maintenance man. He says, "Well, we'll find out how good you are, Private." And that was my first flight in an airplane. After taking off, I was deathly scared and in complete fear of the fact that I did not perform my job as a mechanic as well as I should have, because my life was on the line. We finally came back, and I did prove to be passing, and we landed, and immediately I went to the commanding officer and requested I be reassigned to another military occupation specialty. He says, "We need gunners, and would you like to be an aerial gunner?" I therefore proceeded to say yes, and then I was relieved of my mechanic's duty and was sent to air gunnery school. My new set of orders given at Jacksonville, Florida, brought me to El Centro, California, where I had the basic training as an aerial gunner. I attended both a radio school, a radar school, and learned different means of communication known as the Morse code and semaphore. Also, gunnery was a very important factor where we did a lot of practice on skeet shooting to perform our accuracy in airborne. After having dive bombing runs, which I was put on an SBD, the Douglas dive bomber. The Douglas dive bomber was very instrumental in the Battle of Midway, which turned the Pacific War in our favor, after the ship was used in many dive bombing events, knocking out the Japanese fleet in the Battle of Midway. In my schooling and gunnery training at El Centro, we gave support to George Patton's Tank Corps in Yuma and parts of Arizona. We also did a lot of dive bombing practice runs over the Salton Sea. A few of my friends and buddies, because they didn't pull out of their dive, perished and died in the Salton Sea. From El Centro, I was transferred to El Toro, California, near Santa Ana, and there we had practice, gunnery range practice and schooling outside of Catalina Island, which was better confined to naval gunnery territory. From El Toro, I was then put on a ship in Miramar in San Diego and sent to Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Passing through Pearl Harbor, as we observed all the naval ships that were sunk by the Japanese, it was an awesome and a very sad sight to see. We were told of the importance of us engaging the enemy for the damage and the pilferage they done here at Pearl Harbor. It not only motivated us, but it instilled us with the idea that we had to perform a duty without any consequence to ourselves. I arrived in Guadalcanal and was stationed in Henderson Field. I noticed all about me that the great war against the Japanese, in which we Americans held the island, Guadalcanal, which was very instrumental because it was the midway point between Australia and Hawaii, a very important strategical piece of land that we needed. Many Americans gave their lives, and especially the Marine Corps' greatest casualty list was first found at Guadalcanal. From Henderson Field, I was then sent to a small little island in the Bismarck Archipelago called Green Island, which we encountered our first combat against the Japanese in the island of New Guinea, and they had a fortified supply area called Rabaul and Cavaillon. This was my first experience in a dive against the Japanese, in which a lot of anti-aircraft and Zero Japanese planes attacked us from various positions. Being a gunner, we flew in a formation of 9 planes to a squadron with fighter escorts of F-6Fs, and sometimes fighter escorts were not only F-6Fs but F-4Us. A fighter pilot with a squadron called the Black Sheep Squadron with Major Boynton was sometimes our fighter escorts. He was quite a fighter pilot, and as you well know, I believe there's a series of TVs that were running depicting the experiences of the Black Sheep Squadron. After hitting the vital points of the Japanese supply lanes in Rabaul, we then found that it was finally taken over by the American ground forces. From there, we were then dispatched to Hollandia, New Guinea. At Hollandia, New Guinea, there was a staging area for the greatest invasion armada, which began heading to the Philippines, unknown to us particular GIs. The first deployment was made at Leyte, and in Leyte of October to November of 1944, the island of Leyte in the Philippines was finally recaptured, and the particular American forces came back to liberate the Philippine Islands. This was the beginning of MacArthur's request and dreams to come back to the Philippines. When General Douglas MacArthur was ordered from Corregidor in 1942 to command the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, he fervently announced that he would return. So far as the public was concerned, the general said he was going to return, and 2.5 years later, he did. On the 3rd of January 1945, General MacArthur was present on board the cruiser Boise. We counted more than 800 ships or more that was in this great armada, heading to the Lingayen Landing Gulf, which is at the Luzon area of the Philippines. We landed on the beaches of Lingayen, and then our armed forces took over the airstrip at Mangaldan. There we established our particular air base with the 5th Air Force, the Marine Air Group 24 and 32, and my squadron VMSB 244 was therefore stationed, and we started to make sorties, dive bombing missions over Manila, Corregidor, and Bataan. Also Clark Air Force Base and Fort Stotzenberg. We supported the ground forces throughout the Luzon area until Manila was finally recaptured and liberated from the Japanese. Something else arose to plague General MacArthur and Admiral Halsey and the whole Pacific Fleet. This was the kamikaze, the body-crashing Japanese pilot who dived his plane into Allied ships and earned himself a ticket to the Japanese Valhalla at Yasukuni Shrine. The kamikaze was the most single effective air weapon developed by the Japanese in World War II. It's nothing known today in our war of terrorism. We still have kamikaze carriers, but now are called bomb-suicidal terrorists. After the completion of the Mindanao invasion, my combat days flying as an aerial gunner, a radio radar gunner in a SBD Douglas dive bomber was over. I attained enough points, and we had a point system, people having spent time overseas, different decorations, and combat areas they participated in, was awarded points, and they were returned back to the United States. I was one of the many that was given that opportunity, and I returned back to the lovely continental United States. 2 days out on board ship heading to San Francisco. VJ Day was finally completed after the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It was a great relief to us, and we all celebrated on board ship, for this was the day we were all waiting for. I returned back to San Francisco, returned back to a place called Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. That was a particular area for Marines being discharged who were stationed or lived or resided on the East Coast. I received my honorable discharge, headed back home once again to see my loving parents and 2 brothers who also participated in the military services during World War II. Completed my term in the Marine Air Wing. I then went over and joined the United States Air Force. It was then called the Army Air Force, and it didn't become a sovereign branch until 1947. In the Air Force, I became a radar controller, controlling aircraft and scrambling aircrafts from various bases to encounter unidentified objects along the Atlantic seaboard. I continued my duties as a controller until I finally was assigned to the new origin of the NATO forces in France. I remained in Paris, France, and then stationed in a little place called Châteauroux, France, Air Force Base, where I worked with the NATO commandos. From there, I returned back to the United States, then reassigned to Taiwan. There I joined the Air America Force, which was a group of CIA flyers done coveted operations overlooking and observing and surveilling the China coastline. I then returned back to the United States and was assigned to the presidential aircraft at Andrews Air Force Base, in which I served there 5 years under the Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and President Johnson's administration, which I was discharged in 1965. This ended my military career. Having served my country as a U.S. Marine and an Air Force member, I feel honored that I made my contribution to the country and free democratic country. With this in mind, I feel this song says it all to us all.
This land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. As I went walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I came shining, and I was strolling, the wheat fields waving, and the dust clouds rolling. As the fog was lifting, a voice came calling. This land was made for you and me.